Great. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just gonna wait a couple seconds for folks to just trickle in. We're so happy that you're with us this morning. So thank you so much for joining. Right. Yes, we are so excited to have you here for our third session in AAPIP's advocacy series. Thank you for just sharing your time with us, especially during busy time with school years winding down, summer vacation starting, and just really appreciate being in community with all of you. So my name is Courtney Chappell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the VP of Membership Programs here at AAPIP. For those who might be new to AAPIP, we are a national affinity organization that really strives to be, a bridge connecting AA and HPI communities and philanthropy. We're membership-based, we're chapter-based. We use strategies like community care and philanthropic advocacy to deepen connections, deepen sense of belonging, build power and engage in systems change work to redistribute wealth in more equitable ways so that all of our communities can thrive. Last month, as part of AA and HPI Heritage Month, we launched a number of new community-centered programs, including 5 affinity spaces and our first AAPIP SIPs, which are kind of a rebranded lunch and learns where we go deeper into identity, power, race. So feel free to check out our website and sign up for our newsletter just to learn more about AAPIP and our membership programs. So earlier this year, back in March, we kicked off this 4-part advocacy series just to really, build the foundation and knowledge about advocacy across our network. We really wanted to, deepen relationships across sectors and just provide a space for ongoing and collective learning. So that first session, back in March was all about kind of the nuts and bolts of advocacy. We had a really great conversation with 4 leaders from philanthropy and from community, where we try to just, unpack the basics, what advocacy looks like, different advocacy strategies, and why and how philanthropy should engage in advocacy work. So if you missed that session, we did record it, so we can, drop that link in the chat box if you want to check it out. For the second session in April, we partnered with Boulder Advocacy to talk more about like the tactical strategies around advocacy, specifically, the IRS tax code definitions for lobbying, the rules for public and private foundations to support lobbying and advocacy activities. So today's session, we hope to kind of build on those 2 conversations and get a little more specific. We want to do kind of a deeper dive into specific advocacy efforts and learn, how those priorities are identified, what success looks like, how we measure impact, and how we navigate tensions and challenges within and beyond our movements and within our own institutions. And also, what are the similarities and differences in engaging in advocacy work in these different sectors, at foundations, community organizations, philanthropic serving organizations. We also really want you to leave today's webinar with just a deeper understanding of how the advocacy work that our speakers will be talking about, how that work is situated, within a broader political and social context, whether related to immigration, racial justice, civic engagement, or other civil and human rights issues. And of course, we want you to leave feeling super energized and hopeful about what philanthropy can do to leverage its own resources and power to pave the way for systems change work. So with that said, we are really grateful to be joined by 3 really inspirational leaders from across the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors, each of whom have been at the forefront of community-centered advocacy work for years. So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. We have Bonnie Kwon, who has years of experience as a community organizer and now serves as the policy officer at the Kellogg Foundation. We have Sin Che, who is the co-director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, and she's also a former AAPIP staff member. And we have Kevin Douglas, Senior Director of Programs at Grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees, or GCIR, which is an organization that's really inspired AAPIP and so many others in its values-driven approach and vision. So thank you so much to the 3 of you for just sharing your time with us. You've been doing this work for just a long time. You have really deep community connections, and there's so much that we can learn from your collective experiences and collective wisdom. and also just, the joy and passion that you each bring to this work. So in terms of just like kind of a loose roadmap of our conversation, we'd love to invite each of you to share in more depth the specific advocacy work that your organizations are leading or focused on. And thank you also to each of you for just thoughtfully putting together some slides to really help bring to life some of the work that you're doing. And we'll share those during your presentations as well. So after that, I'll have a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll open up for some questions from those tuning in. So please feel free to drop any questions that folks have in the chat. I'll do my best to kind of weave them in throughout the discussion. And like I mentioned, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. And then we plan to wrap up our conversation at the top of the hour. We hope this will be just super engaging, honest dialogue about the advocacy landscape, about movement work, including the upsides, downsides, within particular sectors. So please feel free to share, as much as you can. So let's just get started. And I'm going to turn things over to Kevin just to share a little bit more about GCIR, about your theory of change, which I know you renewed and redeveloped, I think, last year. And of course, the advocacy work that you all are currently focused on, I think, around asylum. So I'm going to turn it over to you right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Courtney, for having me on this morning. It was really a pleasure to get to connect with you in advance of this, as well as Brandon. Really awesome team. And we appreciate sharing space with you and the other panelists today. So as you mentioned, my name is Kevin Douglas. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Senior Director of National Programs with GCIR, or Grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees. Like AAPIP, we are a national philanthropic intermediary organization. We really work to move money and power from philanthropy into the movement, and we conceive of ourselves as really sort of being not necessarily, we sort of switch the vernacular a little bit. Very often groups are conceived of as PSOs, or philanthropic support or serving organizations. We conceive of ourselves as a philanthropic mobilizing organization, meaning more of an active role and actually being partners and leading with philanthropy the change that we want to drive forward, which really is why we want to be part of this conversation on sort of advocacy work. And so if we go to the next slide, when we think about why GCIR thinks it's important to engage in advocacy, there's this wonderful quote and story that I love. I'm sure folks have heard before. Very short version about people, floating downstream. They're in trouble, distress. Someone jumps in, pulls them out, pets them off, and another person comes down the stream. They jump in and pull them out. And just the idea that you can kind of stand there all day pulling people out of this stream, or find out like who's throwing them in. What are the systems? What are the causes that are leading to sort of these social ills that need sort of remediation by nonprofit organizations, by philanthropy, volunteers, community, et cetera. And so really for us, our belief is that we work on immigration, and we don't conceive of the problem as something that derives with individuals. We have a broken immigration system, and there are reasons why people move and should have the right to move. And so we think it's important, if we recognize there's systemic issues, that we take a systemic approach to solving them, right? So that requires advocacy and policy engagement, not just direct service intervention, as important as that is to meet immediate humanitarian needs. So if we could go to the next slide, just really quickly, you had mentioned we went through a process of developing a new theory of change for ourselves. I'm not going to go through this all. Folks are welcome to take a look at our website and take a look at it. But I think the part that I want to lift up is our problem statement. We all know that the way that you define a problem is how you choose to respond to it. And we thought it was important to be very explicit about naming things like racial capitalism, militarism, imperialism as the root causes of why people lack the freedom to stay or to move or to thrive. And all of sort of the rhetoric that we see in the news about sort of immigration it's devoid of the context about why people move and why they should have the right and ability to move. And so again, us sort of seeing racial capitalism, militarism, and these other systemic forces as challenges for community, it then behooves us in the philanthropic sector to invest in ways and to act in ways to sort of remediate those systemic issues. So that's a little bit about sort of how our theory of change connects to our decisions to engage in advocacy work. Moving to the next slide, anyone who's done advocacy work knows it can feel like this, pushing a boulder up a hill and it rolls back down, you push it up and rolls back down, and it sort of can like beg the question of like, is it worth it? Why are we doing this? And for us, we think that, this is such, it's hundreds of years in the making. The problems that we face here in the United States around xenophobia, racism, patriarchy, and it takes a long time to undo. And so we think it's important to just remain steadfast and take consistent longitudinal approach to the work of pushing system change and understanding there'll be setbacks, but you still have to engage in the policy work on the day-to-day basis. And we go to the next slide. There's so much at stake in our world these days, from sort of attacks on women's reproductive health, on trans communities, recent decisions around Fearless Future, the genocide in Gaza, attacks on immigrant communities. Just all of these attacks are happening all the time. But as you see in the pictures, there are movements behind each of these spaces and identities and communities pushing back, and they have successes in different ways. And so we really see our role as, how do we help in the immigration context? Funders lean into, recognize, appreciate, and support the policy and advocacy work necessary to address these. So for us, when we think about, if we go to the next slide, we are not a direct service provider, we're not a policy shop, we're not a funder, or this interesting intermediate organization. So the question for us is like, what is our role and why do we engage in advocacy specifically? I think, looking at the left side of the slide to begin with very quickly, we recognize that the Overton window, or the set of possibilities that society is considering on immigration, has shifted seriously to the right and very extreme anti-immigrant sentiments. And we think it's important that philanthropy helps shift that dialogue and that sort of narrative back to sort of more progressive visions of an inclusive society. And it's not enough to just sort of sit back and fund interventions when there's crises like family separation at the border, but we actually have to say that's unacceptable and shift the dialogue, right? And so you can see listed there a couple of other goals that we have in terms of what we as an institution want to do in our work. I'll just lift up two of these. One is we want to be partners with the movement. We understand that folks are working on the front lines day in, day out to affect change, and we have a platform where we can help amplify that and lift it up and help try to push forward those policy goals and aims. The second thing that I would name from this list is we want to push philanthropic practice. We want to sort of help funders get comfortable with the idea and that they have a role actually in working alongside the field in pushing for change and not just funding the change. Yes, we need to fund it, but we also can be a part of it. There's more I could say here, but I want to be conscious of time, so I'm going to keep moving forward to the next slide. This is high level our policy agenda. If you go to our website, it's much more detailed. What I would name about this is, this agenda represents an evolution from our previous approach, where we used to name specific policies, bills, and say we support this, we oppose this. And what we realized or understood was that for many funders, there's some trepidation, some misunderstanding sometimes around philanthropy's ability to weigh in on specific policies or bills, when you can lobby, when you cannot. If you're a community foundation, if you're a private foundation, there's different sort of rules you sort of have to follow. And so we realized that if we sort of zoomed out a little bit and sort of categorize all the policies we cared about under sort of values-based umbrellas and principles, that would make our agenda a little bit more accessible to folks and allow people to engage in it. So there are specific bills connected to each of these, but at a high level, this is what we're sort of with our network in the world in terms of what our priorities are and what we want to move forward. So diving into the first one, and the example for today, I'll just really quickly talk about is asylum. If we go to the next slide, I think folks, unless you've been living under a rock, are sort of aware that for the past, 5, 10, even 30 years, like our immigration system has really been getting worse in many ways. And under the last administration, it really accelerated the sort of reduction of people's ability to lawfully seek asylum. We saw things like Remain in Mexico, metering, Title 42, Muslim ban. There were so many policies across the board that were intended to narrow this sort of range of possibilities where people could present themselves and make a case for asylum. And a lot of folks sort of thought, at the change of the administration, we were going to see a shift in that. And while there have been some policies that have been more inclusive, we saw one this morning actually out of the administration on asylum, it's not gotten better. And in some ways it's gotten worse. Folks may have seen a couple of weeks ago, there was a new executive order that essentially shuts down the border once we hit a certain number of irregular crossings a day, and leaves it closed for a period of essentially 21 days, depending on how you count the timers and when they reset, et cetera. And so for us, this is a fundamental threat to people's the promise of America, the right for people to come here, make their claim about sort of the circumstances that they're fleeing and sort of have their day in court, so to speak, to have their claims heard. And so for us, this has been one of our top priorities we've been working on this year. And some of the actions we've taken on this topic include, if we go to the next slide, organizing sign-on letters from philanthropy. Earlier this year, back in January, when there was discussions between Congress and the president at that time about limiting asylum, we authored a letter and submitted it to the congressional leadership and to the president, and had philanthropy join us in sort of opposing those changes. We organized legislative meetings. For the past 2 years, we've gone to DC with a small contingent of funders, be part of something called Foundations on the Hill, where we met with Department of Homeland Security. We met with a bunch of Senate and House offices, and essentially we're talking about the importance of preserving asylum and not sort of compromising on it. We also do funder education, so we'll do webinars like today's webinar, sort of where we bring in field experts to present on issues and help funders understand the sort of what's at stake in terms of asylum, so they're then in a position to be activated, and sign on or join our advocacy actions. We also do a lot of amplification of the movement and sort of rallies or hearings or sign-ons, and sort of use our platform to uplift their messaging. And then we also do state level advocacy that helps support our federal goal. So if our federal goal is to preserve and support people's right to seek asylum, part of our work in California has been to help preserve the legal services infrastructure that allows people, to navigate through the asylum system. And so engaging funders and advocacy at that level as well. So there's more I could say, but I think I'm probably at time, so I'll pause here and turn it back to you, Courtney.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for just sharing the work that GCIR is doing. And I really, so much I was thinking about when you were talking, really just appreciate kind of changing the, language around philanthropic serving organizations, PSOs to philanthropic mobilizing organizations. I really love that framing very much. And so thank you so much for naming that. And also this whole idea of, is it worth it, right? Systemic change, it's a lifetime of work, and so it always feels like it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And we'll talk a little bit about this later on with the questions, but just to really appreciate you also kind of naming that this work is hard and takes a long time, and just being very consistent. And finally, just thinking about how you're presenting, your advocacy work. I think there's tendency for funders to shy away from advocacy, because they conflate it with lobbying and their limitations, even though there are foundations that can do lobbying, right? But it's a mix. So really appreciate you uplifting the different strategies that you all at GCIR are focused on to move your advocacy work forward. So thank you. So I'm going to pivot and think about kind of advocacy from a community organization perspective. So Sin, would love to invite you to share more about Chinese for Affirmative Action, and just a deeper look at the advocacy work that you all are focused on around narrative change and anti-Asian scapegoating.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And it's really great to be back. We're at AAPIP, where I called AAPIP my home for 10 years. And of course, I love this topic of advocacy, especially during these times. We are a part of many, many different campaigns, but I'm going to highlight the Stop the Blame campaign for today, mainly because it is a campaign that is recognizing both the fragility of our democratic institutions, but also the racialized and political and anti-immigrant environment that we're in, that I think is so important, especially in this consequential election year. But before I do that, if we could go to the next slide, I just want to share a little bit about CAA. We're a 55-year-old community-based civil rights organization that does hyper-local work in San Francisco around services for our immigrant population, but also has always an eye towards working on state and national and at the federal level with regard to opportunities for systems change work. And that's really at the heart of what we do. We combine both on the ground information and the direct experiences of impacted people, and we try to develop solutions at the systems level. And we do that with community-based organizations, as well as with other entities, including government. And I want to also name that we are a co-founding partner of Stop API Hate, which is a national coalition to address anti-Asian racism. And we're part of many coalitions, but I raise that because that'll become really relevant as I talk about the campaign. So next slide. I think it's incredibly important to recognize the current environment that we're in and the rise of anti-Asian scapegoating. So I think everyone knows that during the onset of the pandemic, Asian Americans were scapegoated for public health reasons. We also know that over this period, there have been rising tensions between US and China, and that has resulted in targeting, surveillance, and blaming Chinese and other people of Asian descent, and either being perceived as Chinese or being painted as a US security threat. And so we have been deeply engaged in this work, actually for quite some time, dating back to the 1990s. And even before that period where Chinatowns and other organizations were being surveilled by the FBI. But with regard to scientists, including the Wen-Ho Lee case, the nuclear scientist who was wrongfully prosecuted for stealing secrets, where there was actually no evidence to be found. So this is an area of work that we have been deeply, deeply engaged in. And quite honestly, we could never get anyone to listen to us in terms of lawmakers, various administrations, until we launched Stop API Hate. And I can talk a little bit more about why that is. Next slide. So, you know, a big part, I think, of what we do is work on narrative change, because we think it's so important, because dominant narratives really affect the will of people, of lawmakers. It really shapes the way that we understand problems. And so, again, we really challenge, for example, the Biden administration with regard to their investigation on the source and origins of COVID-19. We really have done a series of reports, including the Blame Game report, which really highlighted how political rhetoric inflames and endangers the lives of Asian Americans. And this is something that we have done consistently throughout. And of course, during this period, we joined efforts to dismantle the China Initiative, which is a Trump-era initiative within the Department of Justice to essentially surveil and prosecute people of Chinese descent or having any connections with China, where there's actually no evidence. And we have a number of incidents and cases where, you know, it was very rampant, it had a chilling effect, and it ruined people's lives, people who are still reeling from this ongoing period of racial profiling. So the context, if we could go to the next slide, Brandon, thank you so much. For Stop the Blame campaign, which we started in the fall of 2023. And it's in essence a broader campaign to call out elected officials, to raise awareness, the general public, and even within our own community, ways in which both rhetoric and policies are essentially discriminatory and dangerous for our communities. And I can go to the next slide to talk more about what the campaign is. So I think many of you may have been reading that there have been a series of land ban bills that have been introduced throughout the country. And we got this really important get on the New York Times, which I think essentially captures, when buying a home is treated as a national security threat. So just wanting to name that since 2023, there have been close to 250 bills that have been introduced in 39 states that essentially restrict foreign entities from purchasing land. And 21 of them explicitly named Chinese non-citizens from purchasing and owning land within 5 miles of a military installation. And I want to say a little bit more about the ridiculousness of these bills, because of course, military installations can include veterans hospitals, veteran affairs offices. But it's even more ridiculous and nefarious in the sense that only 1.8% of agricultural land is owned by foreign entities, and 3.1% privately. But the largest foreign entities are from countries Canada, Netherlands, and Italy. So the manufacturing that this is a problem, that this is a national security threat, is something that I think everyone should be really concerned of. And essentially what we're also seeing is, and you can see on the next slide of the maps, of the map of the country where we have either legislation that have been proposed or passed or pending. And you can see a pattern. You are seeing largely red states that are introducing these bills, whipping up fear. And I want to actually, going into the next slide, talk about the fact that we have situations like in Louisiana, where it's actually restricted to lease, to rent to foreign entities. And we have some bills like Georgia and others that are actually criminalizing real estate transactions. And it's had such a chilling effect for the community, and not just for the Chinese community, but much broader. So what are we doing to fight this, these series of land bans that really, again, hearken to the alien land laws that prevented thousands and thousands of Japanese Americans from owning land in California? What we're doing is essentially getting in the fight at the state level. So we have actually been involved in focusing on specific states that are enacting discriminatory laws. And this is something that we believe is really necessary because these fights are happening at the state level. We are also very engaged in the narrative work that is going to be required. So that New York Times article was really important because, I mean, imagine that Chinese and other Asians are being, and other immigrants are being prevented from purchasing a home, from establishing roots, where there is actually no viable or evidence-based problem around this issue from purchasing a home. And so this idea that this is very un-American, that this shouldn't be allowed, that this has happened before and we can't let it happen again. Another aspect of our campaign is we're mobilizing communities across the country and in the states where we have these land bans. And what's exciting about that is we are activating first-time or community members who are being activated for the first time, showing up at rallies, really speaking to the media, talking about the impact. So really centering the experiences of community members and really leaning into the power of storytelling. Next slide. So what we actually, just to get a little bit granular, and I want to be mindful of the time remaining, is that it's very, very important that as a national organization, we are working very closely with local groups. And we do have some lawmakers who also see that what is happening in their state is discriminatory. We're working with them in developing the campaigns. And what we're especially skilled at is getting media attention. And that's what the Stop API Hate platform has really enabled us to do. There are very specific states that are what we consider some of the worst offenders, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. And we are actively working with the legal advocacy groups like ACLU and ALDEF based in New York, as well as unusual players that we have never worked with before, such as the real estate coalitions and entities and organizations. And of course, we work with community-based organizations as well. And the next slide. And this is my final slide, which is that I want to be honest about the barriers. One is that this is an issue that is really not on anyone's radar. We're trying to build understanding and awareness just because this is such a fundamental belief in this country that anyone should be able to purchase a home, establish roots. And so we believe that there is an incredible opportunity to bring awareness around this. The other barrier is that this is bipartisan. So we do have both Republicans and Democrats really engaging and fueling anti-China and scapegoating. And this is something that we really need to unify around and to develop more measures and ways in which we're holding elected officials accountable. And the work ahead of us, as Kevin has shared, this is long-term work. This is not an issue that's going to go away this year, regardless of who becomes, who wins the national election. In fact, we have continued to really oppose many of the Biden's administration's executive orders and efforts that contribute towards anti-Asian scapegoating. So we believe this work is, again, long-term. This is something that we have to be vigilant on. And I think finally, we're extremely proud of the fact that, you know, we don't take on easy issues like affirmative action and non-citizen voting. This is something that we really have to get both the general public and including our community understanding that national security scapegoating is really a threat to our democracy and puts our community members in danger. So I'm going to conclude there and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sin. And yet, you're right, like this is not an issue that I'm as familiar with either. So just really appreciate you uplifting it and naming it. And it's also, we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit too, but just kind of the collaborative coalition work, you know, that you put together with national groups, community members, government, unlikely partners that you mentioned, right? Real estate associations, right? So it's just interesting to see, and we can talk more about that later, how that came together and kind of challenges doing that work cross sector. And then just the emphasis on the narrative change. It's just so important as part of an advocacy strategy, right? Like we see this all the time. We're incorporating that as well at APIP, you know, specifically around affirmative action, and how just central storytelling is and activating community members. Like you mentioned, like first time folks who've never engaged in advocacy, right? Like bringing them into this work is so vital. So thank you so much for sharing that campaign. So Bonnie, would love to invite you to share the perspectives from a foundation and some of the advocacy work that you all leading. I know that Kellogg is doing so much around racial justice and healing, and then also doing a lot of internal work as well. So would love to invite you to share some of the work that you all are focused on.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Is there a slide prior to this one? It may have been lost in transit. Okay, there we go. This one. Yes, thank you. So hi, everyone. Bonnie Kwon, share pronouns, and I'm a member of the policy advocacy team at the Kellogg Foundation. I wanted to start by just sharing how we define advocacy for ourselves and also as a resource across the foundation. We say that advocacy is any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, supports, or defends or pleads on behalf of self and others. And with that, rather than tell you our mission, I wanted to share with you our vision statement because I love the work of dreaming, and this is what we dream for. The Kellogg Foundation envisions a nation that marshals its resources to ensure that all children have an equitable and promising future where all children thrive. Next slide. And to build that future, the policy advocacy, oh, it's the one with like the beautiful, okay. To build that future, the policy advocacy team is committed to fostering a robust ecosystem where community members are active participants in the policymaking process. Organizations that develop community members as active leaders engaged in policymaking, from ideation to evaluation, including identifying the solutions, fighting for their adoption, implementation, and determining if policies were successful is central to our approach. Our grantees work with partners that have skills and capacities, including policy advocacy, research, as well as thought leadership, including narrative and cultural strategies. I really love the part of Sin's presentation that really talked about how important the narrative and worldview battles are. So slide 3, this approach that I just described in how we think about policy advocacy is really about rebalancing power so that policy and systems change efforts are accountable to the communities directly affected by them. And really, it's about communities having the ability to influence decisions that impact their lives. Our approach is rooted in the Kellogg Foundation's longstanding commitment to racial equity and healing. And it really functions as a crucial catalyst for change to empower communities to confront and address entrenched historic injustices by explicitly acknowledging the historic injustices that are enshrined in policies and laws, and then leveraging policy change to rectify and address the ongoing repercussions of systemic racism. We think that that's how you build a future where all children and all people have dignity and joy. So slide 4, that's the context of the campaign that I briefly wanted to share with you. It's a little bit different than kind of a outwardly facing campaign that engages multi-sectoral partners, because I wanted to share a little bit about behind the scenes work that occurs to build a campaign that supports and stands with our grantee partners. We called it our Defending Equity campaign, and it launched last spring in anticipation of last summer's SCOTUS decisions on affirmative action. And the foundation decided it was important to use our platform and power as a funder to unequivocally and publicly state our continuing support for racial equity and underscore the need for race-conscious policies. So policies that are designed in acknowledgement of historic and systemic racism, because we did anticipate what we're seeing today is that there are escalating attacks at all levels of local, state, and federal policy, as well as in legislative arenas, administrative arenas, and as we're going into November electoral arenas. And we wanted to be able to stand with our partners, because that is really the job of philanthropies, is not only to invest in community solutions and community-led campaigns and advocacy, but to use our power to have their back. And so this campaign is what we called at the time an all-of-foundation approach. And we built it into a few streams of work. One was internal education and alignment. Like any other campaign that that our grantee partners are leading, it really has to start with educating folks about how to make meaning of what's happening and to build that alignment so that we're moving together. Moving together might not mean that we're moving perfectly in sync, but we are all driving for the same outcome, which is the ability to continue to champion racial equity and racial justice. The other was around strategic communication. So how are we using our own voice, but how are we also resourcing our partners to continue speaking to power, including doing their advocacy work, and importantly, being able to speak in a way that defends the work of their organization. The other was really the bread and butter of what we should be doing is short and long-term grant making for community power. So that meant for us identifying those who are going to be able to quickly take the decision and translate it into products, talking points, one-pagers that everyday folks would be able to understand. And at the same time, be engaging and building that same alignment in communities. And so we were really honored to be able to actually support Chinese for Affirmative Action in the work that they were doing deep in communities, especially those that are immigrant and non-English speaking. And lastly, the role that our team helped play for the campaign was doing research and landscaping to see what was coming and to share that information both internally as well as with our partners, our grantee partners, our other community partners, and do that in a way for us internally to continue making sure that our leaders understood the changing landscape and contour and terrain that our grantee partners were facing, not just in respect to the attacks on race-conscious policy, but in this climate of increased fear around engaging in just advocacy work. So not lobbying, it can be lobbying, but the broader bucket of activities that we define as advocacy. So the last slide is just a snippet from an email that we sent out ahead of the decision from our CEO. And it was just letting our partners know, who are our most important audience and partners, that we would be standing firm with them. So that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie. So a couple things that you mentioned that really just resonate, just talking about the importance of the behind the scenes work, right? Like in terms of developing and supporting advocacy campaigns, the work of your grantees, that's so important, particularly at a large foundation, right? Where everyone's entering this work in different ways, right? Like the education is so vital, like to make sure that folks are really on board within your institution. And so there's advocacy that has to be done, like you mentioned, advocacy is both external and internal, right? So I think that's a really important point. And then also accountability, which is, I think we're always talking about accountability, like who are we accountable to in this field, in this work, in this sector, and as you mentioned, communities, they are at the heart of this work, and those closest to what do they say? Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and they need to be incorporated at every step of the way. So thank you for uplifting those points and all the work that you all are doing at Kellogg. So folks, if you want to just, if there are questions that folks have, feel free to just drop them in the chat. I do have some questions that I can just start us off with, and then we can just kind of go from there, if that works for Sin and Kevin and Bonnie. So I have a question for you all. Again, thank you so much for just sharing the work, the advocacy work that you all are leading and coordinating. One of the questions, I guess it's kind of the question, is all about measuring impact, and success, and I think all three of you mentioned this, right? Progress during advocacy work is incremental, it's long-term. Could you talk about how your organizations measure the impact of your work, measure success? This is, how do we know that we're on the right track? What do benchmarks look like, metrics look like for work that is messy? It's not linear, and it takes a long time. As Sin, you mentioned that at the very end, right? And Kevin as well, like this is long term. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be really helpful for folks to hear. Who would like to start?
Yeah.
Sin, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, just to give perspective, you know, we started in San Francisco this effort to give the ability of non-citizen parents the right to vote for school board members in their local school elections, because school board members and who gets elected really determine and have an impact on the quality of their child's education and so many other issues related to their educational rights. And it took us 15 years to pass that in San Francisco. So I just want to acknowledge, and I love what Bonnie said, which is like, we have to dream, you know, like we have to dream about these castles in the sky and then build underneath that, right? And so I think that some of the things that that's been really important is culture change and the narrative change, socializing this idea that regardless of your immigration status, your national origin, who you love, where you come from, you have the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And so this fundamental right has been something that I think we have really tried to hone in on in terms of the power of individuals and stories. And I think that what's really important is we have to build the infrastructure to be able to do this. So how do you get media attention? How do you become the go-to source on the issues that you're leading around? So whether it's affirmative action, whether it's around immigrant rights, that's incredibly important. And I think our movement is really important, the infrastructure, like the individual organizations, but the coalition work, the trust building that needs to happen. And the fact that we have this ecosystem where we have folks whose expertise is around legal advocacy, but we also need people on the ground. We also need people online. We are dealing with massive issues around misinformation and disinformation, around who's coming in through the border. And it's contributing towards this cesspool of an environment that is very challenging. And I think that's something that's really different than prior periods of times that we really need to get a grip on. So that's just some of the lessons over the decades that I think are really fueling and shaping how we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sin. Kevin, Bonnie, can you want to add about just, you know, measuring impact and, you know, how do we know we're on the right track?
Sure, I can hop in for a second. One thing that I think is important for us is that we very often are in a position where we are advising, encouraging funders to act in a certain way. You know, how should they fund? How can they go more deep in the work? What sort of practices can they use that create more flexibility for folks? And also, how are they measuring impact in a longitudinal way and not just sort of expecting year-over-year outcomes? And so as sort of a voice to philanthropy, we have to sort of like internalize this as well for ourselves. And so we are not necessarily setting up these like very short-term internal indicators and more so sort of understanding in a way almost like what are the outputs. So like how are we centering, you know, the principles in our theory of change in our work? How are we bringing in conversations around sort of asylum access to our work? Are we engaging more funders and opportunities to sign on to letters? Are we bringing folks with us to DC? So in some ways it's sort of seeing where we were as an institution and then acknowledging the sort of work that we're doing to move toward a more engaged, robust advocacy infrastructure within our network, and sort of giving ourselves the grace to understand that we ourselves are not going to be the deciding factor in whether like asylum is reformed in the country, right? Like we're a contributor too, but we don't sort of hold ourselves to like that outcome we're responsible for. So it's a little bit just like how we're conceiving of outcomes, you know, outputs, inputs, all of this, as opposed to just like pure quantitative measures or did this bill pass or did it not. So I'd say it's a little bit like how we're thinking about just being conscious about how we approach the work.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, right? I think we're just so socialized to think about data and numbers and quantity, like you mentioned, quantitative information as victories, right? And so kind of reframing kind of what success and engagement, or engagement as success, right? I think is really important as well. Bonnie?
I mean, I love what Kevin and Sin shared. So I may just offer a couple points as one, and Sin touched on this, is instead of thinking about what is success, it's like, what is the health of the ecosystem and the different folks who are addressing any given issue, and also together have and are building alignment on an agenda that they want to see. So instead of one-off policy changes, which are important because they are, steps on a ladder towards a broader agenda. I think the other thing is that I try to incorporate into every check-in call I have with grantees is like, how are you? And how are your people? Like, how is the staff doing? I think so often as funders, because of our respective institutions' expectations around outcomes and metrics, that we forget that these are humans, like these are our people, these are our, mentors, leaders, friends, and that we have to really hold folks. And I think that the role of, like APIP members in philanthropy is to make sure that we continue to center our partners and each other too.
No, thank you for saying that. Yes. Bringing the humanity back into the discussion, right? Like so often gets left behind because we're so focused on other pieces. So really glad that you could have uplifted that and that important reminder. And that should be at the center of everything. I don't see any questions in the chat. So I have a couple of other questions. Oh, there's one question for Sin in QA. So let me just pull that up. So Sin, you mentioned working with a number of great community-based organizations as well as real estate entities, which is rare and creative. Could you tell us more about how you work with real estate entities?
I mean, if you would have asked me if that, that was on, our plan to engage real estate agent entities association, I mean, I think it just came up naturally in terms of who was speaking out about this issue. And I think we were approached that even with the bills not being even with that, without the passage of the bills, that it has had a chilling effect. And of course they have self-interest, right? Because it affects their industry. But I think the bigger lesson here is we need to be really open to the idea that we do have to expand the possibilities of who could be potential partners and effective partners. And I'll even extend that to lawmakers. When we were fighting against the reauthorization of essentially our government being able to spy on everyday Americans, we ended up working indirectly, I would say, with GOP members, because they also saw, they may have had different motivations around this, but I think the idea that we can't be purist in terms of who we think should be our effective partners. And I think that it's incredibly important to really expand our networks and the people that we work with. And so some of these people who joined our fight for the first time may have been against affirmative action, right? But they wanted to come out against this issue. So it's really about engaging as many people as possible. Because I think it's important that we involve more and more people and not just talk with people who are within our spheres of influence at the moment. Yeah.
That's a great reminder, because you're right. Some of these issues, you will have unlikely partners that you never would have thought of before. And you mentioned that might be on the other side of other issues that you're working on. And so how do you kind of balancing all of those, engaging folks? Thank you for answering that. So we are running out of time. So I have all these other questions to ask, but I'm just going to jump to just the final question and thoughts that you have. election year. You all mentioned that. And elections are often kind of inflection points as we think about our values as a community, our values as a country. So what conversations do you hope philanthropy will have in order to better support, long-term advocacy, movement work, systems change work?
I'll kick us off to say that
Okay.
we are organizing several scenario planning spaces for philanthropy this year, but I think our disposition orientation to it is to not necessarily just gather funders to think about the election, but gather funders to hear from the community about how they're thinking about the election. And so philanthropy's role is to respond to and resource the plans that the field is developing. And so we're sort of approaching that way. How do we create these spaces for shared learning? The other piece I think is really important is we're trying to encourage philanthropy not to live in a space of it's just about the election and it's just about GOTV funding now, but this is part of a much broader, this is 10, 20, 30-year fight for justice on any of the issues that we've talked about in today's call. And yes, the election year is important. Yes, we'll do scenario planning. Yes. And it's a long-term, sustainable, flexible funding stream that is going to support the movement's ability to develop capacity, have wellness and sustainability into the future. And so paying attention to the election while also situating that appropriately in a longer term context.
Bonnie, do you want to go?
Sure. I think there's two things I'd say. One is that I think the same thing that Kevin said is that this is just one moment in history. And I'll say what keeps me up at night is this concern that philanthropy as a sector will see an election outcome that is unfavorable as a reason to go into protection mode for their self and their own resources and reputation, instead of standing firm and, if anything, increasing investments. I think that's a thing that is a live discussion, and it's really going to be contingent upon everyone who's a part of this call today, including all the participants, to each do our work. And then I think the other thing is that the longer vision is we want an agenda that reflects our priorities, that reflects our community's priorities. And so I think the question we need to be asking ourselves is, what is it going to take next year to build for the next election? And what is it going to take in the next 5 and 10 years to be doing the lifetime of work that both Sin and Kevin have spoken to?
That's funny. Sin,
I
last
know
words?
we're at the end. I mean, I think this idea of longer term and focusing on investments that are about the health and growth of our ecosystem, the social change ecosystem, and we know that there are actually efforts underway now that are going to weaponize the IRS to go after foundations. This is not the time to retreat. This is the time to dig in, to prepare, but also to know that this is ultimately about how we work together. So working with your grantees and working across sectors, it's going to be vital. It's going to take all of us. And again, regardless of the election outcomes, we need to be thinking longer term.
Absolutely agree with everything that you three said and shared. And yes, this is a moment. It's not just about one election. It's an opportunity to, as you mentioned, Bonnie, dream big, reimagine our communities and our country and the values that drive us. So thank you so much. Just deep, deep appreciation to Bonnie, Sin, Kevin, just for being part of today's discussion. You've just shared so many great perspectives and, really appreciate the deeper dive into the work that you all are leading. So much of what you said and shared just really resonated. And I'm still kind of processing and thinking about, how we can, better approach philanthropic advocacy at AAPIP with many of the points that you all raised up. So thank you again for being here. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Just a quick reminder that our fourth and final session in our advocacy series will be next month, Tuesday, July 23rd. And we will be partnering with the API Civic Engagement Fund to kind of continue some of the conversations we had just now, and to learn more about the AA and HPI electorate and how philanthropy can continue to support civic engagement efforts, not just for November, but beyond. So it's going to be a really good conversation. So please keep an eye out for that registration link. And we'll be sending this webinar recording out as well. So feel free to reach out with any thoughts and follow-up questions. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and joining us. And yeah, we will see you at the next APIP event. Thanks again.
Thank you.